Hey people, it's Saturday morning, second cup of coffee. It's going to be a scorcher out here again today. So last week I made a short and I told you about ego. When it says, and I am the God that took you out of bondage, the word is ego in the Greek and in the Latin. When it says, I am that I am, the word is ego. And so you got to conquer ego before you come out of bondage. Your ego is your drive. It controls your hairstyle and the clothes you wear and what you drive. This is what the old man represented in the Golden Child. He didn't give a shit what nobody thought. He was a con man, shyster, nose picking, booger wiping, disgusting old panhandler. And you see that in Exodus 3:13 and 14 when says Moses to the God, who am I, ego, to tell the Pharaoh to turn my people loose? And what shall I tell him's your name? And wise in and says of God to Moses, to motion, at has promotion, a legend. Ego, they mean, I am. And you see here in Latin, and says Moses at doom, at God, because ego vadum at files. They say this is two, and love or brothers, anything like that. But, and they always say this is because ego vadum. Vadum is stays here, to invade them, lives here. Ego vadum and add and file, F-I-L-E, the I reads the E, add files, to where it's at. Vadum at files. And Dixit Deuce and says God to motion again. And ego, I am. And so ego is the go, it's the drive, and the goesum. And replace the QU with a WH. And goesum, wisem. This is your drive. The reason they go, that goes them, is because of them. Your ego is the first thing you have to conquer before you get enlightenment, because the ego controls everything else. Your ego, the way you want other people to see you, it controls what you feel and you do and you love, you speak, and what you see, or what your perception is of what you see and your understanding. First you have to clear up the ego. And don't give a fuck what nobody else thinks. But you don't want to destroy your ego. You just want to put it aside. So the ancient priests discovered, the best way to destroy somebody's ego is after you beat them down in front of anybody in a fight, you fuck in the ass. And that's the Greek, the vassal, the king, and the Vaseline in his kingdom. And I actually found where that says that in the Hebrew too. The Dixit do's ad motion, the goesum wisem. The I am, the reason you do what you do, the why I get up and go in the morning, my ego. And in the Hebrew is via, by way of an MR, Mr. All, him, all is. We is all of that. Mr. All, him, all ism C. And then AE, ASC, as, and EYE, as I, assure as I. And then when you read the A words backwards and you ignore this mark here, it's via by way of, and an MRS. Final M becomes a S. And miss, and Anna, A-N-A. And Anna, and N-A-M-S-E. And miss on a names. Names is the headwear of power in Egypt. and then backwards, EYE, I, and ARS. R is a conjugation of am, I am, I are, and R's. Via Miss Anna names, I, R's. And then AE, as I. And I am what I am. I R's as I. But while I was reading into this chapter, I seen that, there's no Egypt in the Hebrew. It's all Mizraim, which comes from the second son of Ham. You see here, my people who are in Egypt, as Emmer save, S-A-V, a save from crime. And you see here the oppression with which Egypt is oppressing them. And, oppressing, usually that's niggas. You see it up higher here. The NGS is the taskmasters, the oppressors, and the oppressed usually. But this is, assure from Assurum, a crime letzomatum. The crime of letzomatum. But I noticed it come up twice right here, as with the double M, my, MM is a MY, and my crime. And Ben is rule my crime, the sons of Israel out of Egypt. And he said, surely I will be, and I am, I will be, Aya. And I will be with you, and this to you is the sign that I have sent you when you bring the people from Egypt. You see, that's the double M, my crime, and Ham, of my crime. And so it was the Greek and the Latin that turned this crime into a gift. No, it's a gift. It's the gift. We didn't steal nothing. And this made me think of the crime of Ham. Ham went into his father's tent, and whatever he saw there, Ham was cursed to be the slave of his brothers. And to the Southern Baptists, Ham is seen to be the black people. In EVIX, EVX, and YA, and a final K is a D, a yod. In out of it's evicts the hand when you bring, evicts its hand. And at and backwards, MOE is a MOVE, and move 'em, at move 'em, my crime. And if you ignore this mark and read the A words backwards, it's just to, and then and to see 'em, my crime. So the crime came after the flood, and Noah's shame and Canaan's curse, and were the sons of Noah that went out from the ark, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, or a Vesum, the Vesum which whipped, WIPT. And you always see this Ham was the father of Canaan, and his Comet, double A is a YA, a Vicin, VICN. And there is no Canaan because the final N reads as a Z, and it's a Vicin as to coming on out, and came out. So that's a bigger clue of what the crime was. And all the nations of the earth came from these three brothers, the sons of Noah. And began Noah, a man of the ground. He planted a vineyard. So it's at least 2 years later before he drank wine, and became drunk, and uncovered himself in the middle of his tent, or who a tuggle into dazzle. And so they say in this big crime here was, and saw Ham, the father of Canaan, the nakedness, always the father of Canaan, and saw the nakedness of his father. And so that's not a big crime enough to turn you into a slave the rest of your life. But the crime was, and told to his brothers. He wasn't supposed to tell, and it was under the rose. Whatever happened up in that tent, wasn't supposed to be talked about. And so then his two brothers went in to cover up the crime and took Shem and Japheth the garment and they laid it on the shoulders of the two of them. They went in backwards and covered the nakedness, the whore, what? O-R-W-T. The whore, what, of their father. And so, being that they had covered up the crime, and awoke Noah from his wine, and he knew what had done to him. Ooh, something feels funny down there. The son of the youngest. Well, the youngest was Japheth, the way they write, usually they're in order. So this is kind of a little twisted here. And he said, "Cursed be Canaan, the son of Ham. A servant of servants he shall be. He'll be the slave of the servants. And he shall be to his brothers." And then for covering up the crime, and blessed Yahweh, God of Shem, and may be Canaan a servant to him. And enlarge, this is where the word Japheth come from. And also Egypt, the gift. And may enlarge God, the Japheth, the lift, that he may dwell in the tents, in the vassaly. In the Greek, the vassal is the king, and the vassaline is the kingdom. In the vassalism. And may be Canaan a servant to them. So there wasn't a whole lot in the crime. It was just that Ham saw, and saw Ham, the father of Canaan, the nakedness of his father. And he told his two brothers. And I thought I would figure out more about what the crime was by looking at what was covered up, because it's a lot longer line here. So in the Latin, this line 23 here, is at where a shmo yappeth. A shmo of et replaces the vav. And at where a shmo is somebody who heard something, and yappeth is hearsay and talking about what they heard. And whereas yappeth, pallium imposure went humor receives. The double S here, I-V-I-S, the humor receives. Ooh, it seems like they found it funny. But a pallium isn't much of a covering. It's about as much covering as a sumo wrestler wears. It's a G-string. And it's this little badge of honor that the Pope wears. In the law of Canaan, the son of Ham. And it's to signify the sheep on your shoulders, the good shepherd. The good shepherd, he wears a necktie. All hail the good shepherd. The pallium is reserved to the Pope and archbishops, who are metropolitans. That coming from the poly, the city, a metro, around the big city. The pallium is also conferred upon the Latin Patriarch of Jerusalem. At where shmo yappeth, a pallium impose, where went whom receives. It and incident is retrorsum. And so an incident is retrorsum, is not necessarily backwards, but it's what a detective does when he comes into a crime scene and he tries to go backwards, from what's left from what he sees, to figure out how it ended up this way. And incident, it is retrorsum. And of the ruer went. A ruer, R-U-E-R, is up your ass. The roo-roo. And of the ruer went, the one that went up in, verenda a patricive. S-I-V-I. The patricive. So the patra is the one on top. During sex relations, you have a uke and a patra. The patra, and you look at it backwards, you see where it comes from, the top. And it comes from an old Egyptian sign. It's the patop. And it looks like the lid of a pan. It means the top. And of the ruer went wherein the top receive. Veranda, that is an open porch, a covered porch with no walls. And of ruer went wherein the pat receive. And faces cue, cue is where you're pointing your cue stick. The faces are looking at the horum of verses errant. An errant is a mistake. And the patra's virilla, and the top is virilla. Virilla is your nuts, your dick, the male sex organ. And the father's virilla is non-viderant, non-seen, vide, a video, and non-viderant. So I put this side by side in the Greek, Latin, and Hebrew. Where the Hebrew is over here on this side of this green line. And, the garment is the smell, the S-M-L-E. And with this little diamond up here, actually it reads S-M-E-L-E, the smell. And nakedness, is the horwut, O-R-U-T, O-R-W-T, the horwut. And then down here, the nakedness is a warwut, W-O-R-W-T, warwut. And you could tell, this is why I find this easy to read, because it's just redneck, and not they saw. And the L followed by the A reads as an N, and it's a Narav, N-A-R-A-V, Narav, and she ain't had ne'er a thing on. We not saw, and war what of I-E reads as an A, A-V-A-M, and war what of Narav, they was naked. But when you read it with the A words backwards, that's when this Narav becomes a pallium. And what it does is it's a warwut, and then the final M backwards is a S, S-E-I-V, a sieve, and then the A-N-A-R-V, the honor of. And warwut sieve, honor of. They were wearing the honor, the pallium. So I'm going to read this with the A words backwards here first. And it's a wife, W-I-Q-H is a W-I-F-E, and it means why, meaning who, and fuck. Q-H is fuck. And why fucks them and whipped. And the double T, so this is reading as a Y-A, and wife some whipped ya. The smell who ism, and all, and sackum, S-K-M, the sackum. You see this in her bed, and all sackum sinum, the I-E reads the A, S-N-A-M, and all sackum zinum, and will cut, W-I-L-C-U, and then backwards, will cut in her. And then a vix, A-V-I-C-S, a vix, and W-T, a vix what? And then the whore what? And backwards, the whore what sieve upon 'em dinner, D-I-N-R-H. The whore what's dinner is a cum in her face, on their faces. The whore what sieve upon 'em's dinner. And war what sieve honor of, was a blessing, was the honor of. And then when you read it with the A word straight, and you read the tack here, these words backwards and forwards, and it's who fucks 'em whiff, W-I-F-T, the smell, the smell, and whiffed a tell, a T and then backwards and forwards, a T-E-L. A tellum's the smell. Who fucks 'em whiffed? A tellum's the smell. Smelled like somebody'd been butt fucking up in here. I remember going up in a club in France one day, and I seen a whole bunch of sailors in there, and it smelled like a bunch of queers been butt fucking in there. And who fucks 'em whiffed? A tellum's the smell. And then the final E, EU, who is 'em? And all, and then backwards, SKS. And all sax comes in 'em. All sax comes in 'em. That's a whore that visits all sax comes in 'em. And illicit, this is ILC, and the vav followed by the A now becomes a T. And illicit, a churn it, CHRNIT. That means you get your turn at the churn, and illicit, a churn it, a whore. Everybody get a shot at this ass. And illicit, a churn it. Who kissed? The vav followed by the A, becomes a T. Who kissed it? Who kissed it, whore, what of 'em, AVM, of 'em, upon 'em, a churn it, war, what of 'em, ne'er of, the whore, ne'er of, war, what of 'em, ne'er of. So it was in the Greek where I found that word uke, for the bottom. And this word for backwards, this is Ephistophanes. And you see it in here twice, Ephistophanes. And in the Septuagint, it's spelled a little different here. It's spelled with the A-N-E-S here. And this nakedness, this is the gym nose in. This is where you were GYM, the gymnasium. They all got naked and wrestled. Bunch of queer men. And the gym knows in what's going on, what they know in the gym, and he knew her, he knows in. But I think this Greek is what told the most. When you look into this Greek god Phanes, and you see in the fist of Phanes, that he's pointing over here at Gemini. Gemini and the fish, Pisces. And so Gemini, Geminos, that's the naked. That's where that comes from. And you see Fane, sometimes you've got these chicken feet, always naked, with the serpent wrapped around him. And they'll say he's the firstborn from the cosmic egg. And that's what the serpent represents, is giving birth to the chicken ranch. Goes by different names, meaning power and thought, often equated with Eros, that's the son of Venus, said to have come from Kronos, created the silver egg of which the universe was burst, the firstborn deity. Phanes emerged from the abyss and gave birth to the universe, and Nyx is said to be the daughter of Phanes, or his older wife. They always take the granddaughter for the younger wife. Considered by Aristophanes the first deity. So as Nyx created the night, Phanes created the day by mingling. He was made the ruler of deities. And tradition states that Phane passed the scepter to Nyx. Nyx later gave the scepter to her son, Uranus, the heavens. And Cronus seized the scepter from his father, and then Zeus took the scepter from Cronus, who holds it present. And some myths say that Zeus intends to pass it to Dionysus, god of wine, Bacchus, god of butt fucking and wine, a.k.a. Noah, and Noah, and he knew his wife, woke Noah from his wine. He knew what had been done to him by the son of the youngest, and began Noah a man of the ground. This would be a husbandman, I believe, in the Latin. No, that's the no for a Greek allosexiterium. A Greek allosex, that means in the ass, a Greek and all a sex. Let everybody have it. And a sexitarium is your assistant. Husbandman would be a Google interpretation of this. But I'm going to look into this Greek in the next video. This would probably get way too long to finish looking at all this. And I'm going to cut this off here. Good day.